Welcome to the seventh installment of Literary Music Series. I am your founder and artistic director. My name is Natalie, and this is the seventh installment, and it is called Pushkin and Tchaikovsky's Onegin. And today we have Professor Irwin Weil, and this is going to be a different type of stream. I'm going to be interviewing him on his vast knowledge of both the novel and verse, which is beloved amongst all Russian speakers and truly around the world, and the famed opera by Tchaikovsky that was taken from the novel by Pushkin. So, welcome to the series.
Thank you very much.
I kind of wanted to start with some general background just to give our listeners a foundational understanding of what we're jumping into. So I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about Pushkin and his meaning to Russian speakers. Pushkin's reputation to Russian speakers is akin to Shakespeare's reputation to English speakers. And the profound element of that I was hoping you could expand upon.
Well, Alexander Pushkin, in the beginning of the 19th century, was a poet who, I think it's fair to say, as you indicated in what you just said, is the Shakespeare of Russia. He's a poet who's enormously popular, had an incredible grasp of the language, and in his poetry when you read his poetry, you hear music. He was a real master of the language, and this was something that he poured into what he called a novel in verse. The title was, in Russian, Eugene Onegin. In English, we say Eugene Onegin. Mm-hmm. What he did, at the time that Pushkin lived, at the beginning of the 19th century, the Russian language wasn't what it is today, because in the first place, the aristocracy, and of course Pushkin was a part of the aristocracy, spoke as much French as they spoke Russian. And many of them thought of the Russian language as a language that was simply used by illiterate peasants, but not a language that they might use. Obviously, Pushkin made of it something much more than just a peasant language, although he didn't hesitate to put the peasant element into his poetry. So what you had was the Russian language, the Church Slavic language, which was a sort of a high element, which was a part of the origins of the Russian language, but which something in the 19th century was associated with the high ideas of the religion. And also the place of the French language, which was a language that many, if not most, of the Russian aristocracy spoke practically as well as they spoke their own native language. And as a matter of fact, Pushkin was a real master of the French language. He put all these things together, and in so doing, he created the modern Russian literary language. If Pushkin hadn't done this to the language, it's hard to say what people like Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and Turgenev and Gogol, who came after him, could have done with the language. So that the effect of Onegin, the effect of his poetry on Onegin was something that really put together the whole literary, the whole ability in this marvelously combined language showed up in Russia. Now, I don't think what I want to say.
Well, that's wow. I don't think many people realize how deeply ingrained Pushkin is and his meaning for the literary tradition is in Russia. He established so much, and he kind of defined the way the language is used artistically in many ways. And I guess just delving a little bit deeper into perhaps one of his most famous and beloved work.
Let me try to put it this way.
Yeah.
The young Pushkin had just come out of a school, which was a very special school. They call it the lycée. That's the French word, of course, for a particular kind of school. He had just come out of the school, and they wanted to make him into a bureaucrat. Well, as a matter of fact, the last thing in the world that Pushkin's Pushkin's way of living could be a bureaucrat was just impossible to think about. But one thing he really liked was the ballet. So one day or one evening, he came into the ballet and passed around a piece of paper where he had a portrait of a very famous French assassin who had just murdered a high-ranking French aristocrat. And on this piece of paper, and with his portrait, he wrote a lesson to the Tsars. This was not exactly something that was calculated to put him in a good position in the Russian society. Of course, the paper immediately fell into the hands of the police, and they called him in, and they said, "What are you doing here? Let me see your poetry." He said, "I've burned it." So, "What do you mean you've burned it?" He said, "Look, give me a pen." In those days, of course, it was a feather. "Give me a pen and I'll write it out for you." And when the police saw the poetry, they said, "My gosh, this is brilliant." They passed it on to the Tsar. Well, they decided that Pushkin was a kind of a loose cannon. We'd better get rid of him. But what they did was to send him into exile down to the southeastern part of the empire, together with the administration of a Russian general. And said to the general, "You should make a good servant of the state. You should make a good bureaucrat out of this young man." Imagine trying to make a good bureaucrat out of Pushkin.
Oh, that's impossible.
Well, he soon got out of that. That was in exile, something like 1,000 miles from Moscow. He soon got rid of that and went on a trip. And on that trip, he got the idea of making this poem, Eugene Onegin. He called it a novel in verse. And what he did was to start to write it in the city of Odessa. But because he wrote a very funny satire about the governor of Odessa, he was kicked out of the city. And so he started to work very seriously on this poem and devoted the next 8 years of his life to composing a poem of 8 chapters. And in each chapter, there's something like 50 sonatas. And he called it his novel in verse. And in this story, he talked about, first of all, a character named Onegin, who was a very strange character, who was in many ways very sensitive to many different things in life, but at the same time couldn't quite fit into the society in which he found, and eventually went to the country estate to take over an inheritance that he got from his uncle, whose death was described in the beginning of the poem. And when he gets to this country estate, he doesn't have many friends. He's not very fond of the people around him, doesn't want to have much to do with him, but there is a young man, a young poet called Nedvetsky, with whom he gets into good relations, in spite of the fact that, as Pushkin says, he wouldn't know one poetic rhythm to another, but he's fond of the young Nedvetsky. And Nedvetsky says to him, "Look, I'm going to a country estate where there's 2 very nice young women. I'd like you to come with me." So, "Oh, come on, I don't want to go." He said, No, you come with me." And when he gets there, he sees that there are 2 sisters. One of them is a young woman with whom the poet Nedvetsky is deeply in love and is ready to marry her. He's paid attention to her with his poetry for many, many years. Her sister, named Tatiana, is a completely different character. She's somebody who obviously is very quiet, not easy to get to, somebody who thinks a lot about poetry, a lot about literature, but is withdrawn from the kind of life that Onegin sees around him. And when he sees that Nedvetsky is in love with this young girl with whom he said, I think you've got the wrong one. You should have, if you really were interested, you should, it's Tatiana that you should have gone after. Well, Lenski's not very happy to hear this. In any case, they leave. And it turns out that Tatiana has seen Onegin and has suddenly fallen deeply in love with him. So she does something that for a young woman in her day was unheard of. She wrote a letter to Onegin, a very beautifully written, obviously by Pushkin, a very beautifully written letter, which she says, as a matter of fact, was in French, because after all, the aristocracy talked French, and he was translating it into Russian. And in his letter, she tells Onegin how deeply she's fallen in love with him, and she wants him to understand her love. She sends the letter, and then, of course, is tremendously embarrassed that she's done something like this. Well, Onegin gets the letter, and in the next part of the poem, she's waiting to get him to come back to get the reaction, and she's deeply embarrassed. This is something that the young woman simply doesn't do. And he comes and he says, look, I got your letter. Don't deny that you sent it. You sent me this letter, and it's beautifully written. You're obviously a wonderful person, but you should understand that marriage with me would be a total hell. I'm not the kind of person that would make a decent husband for you. You should go for someone else. But he says, take my advice. Another person would have received this letter not the way I do. You should be very careful in what you do. And of course, when I see this reaction, if I would have there, I would have punched him in the nose for him to talk to a woman like Tatiana and telling her to be, of all people, tell her she should behave herself. But in any case, the poem goes on. Mm-hmm. And Lenski, again, there's a name day party. You know that in those days, people were often named after saints, and the saints' name day, that is, the date of the birth, was the what we would call the birthday party of the person, and it was Tatiana's name day. And he says to Onegin, you should come with me to this. And Onegin says, nah, I don't want to go to anything like that. I'm not interested in these people. He says, no, look, you come with me. Well, grudgingly, Onegin goes with him. And when he goes there, of course, everybody, all the neighbors have been invited to this party. They gossip about this fellow who doesn't want to have anything to do with him. And the gossip is rather unpleasant. And Onegin is upset. So he says, I'm going to teach Lenski a lesson for this, dragging me to a place like this. And what he does, he goes to Olga, the sister that Lenski is deeply in love with, and he begins to sort of flirt with her and to invite her to dance with him. And of course, Lenski is furious. Mm-hmm. He's become so furious. He says, you, Onegin, you're nothing but a no-goodnik. I'm using a rather English word here. You've done a terrible thing. It's not enough that you've got Tatiana going after you. You're going after my girl. And Onegin says, no, look, calm down. But in order to teach Lenski a lesson for inviting to this, he continues the flirtation, and he even takes all the dances with Olga so that Lenski can't go to her. And Lenski is positively furious, and he wants to challenge Onegin to a duel. Mm-hmm. When he does this, Onegin realizes that he's gone too far, and he tries to rebuild the friendship, but Lenski will have none of it, and sure enough, he challenges to him a duel. And right before this duel, Pushkin has a poem which is absolutely beautiful about what he's anticipating. Perhaps he's going to be killed in this duel. How will life go on? He wants Olga to love him, and I would like to. And this is the way Lenski feels. Mm-hmm. The poem is absolutely beautiful, but at the end, Pushkin reduces it with a terrible irony. He says, some people would call this romanticism. I don't see any romanticism in it. This is the foolish nonsense of a young man, a young poet who doesn't really know what to do. So on the one hand, he's built up something beautifully romantic, and on the other hand, he wipes it out with his own irony. Well, the duel takes place, and tragically, Lenski is killed. And Onegin suddenly realizes that he's done something terrible. In the first place, he had no business in making fun of Lenski's love to Olga. And here, a person who's been his best friend in this place, his best and his only friend, he's murdered him. So, of course, what he does is leave. And when Tatiana hears about this, of course, she's tremendously upset. The man in whom she invested so much emotion did something which is so terribly immoral. And eventually, she marries an older general and goes to live in St. Petersburg. A few years later, Onegin comes back to Petersburg, and in an evening, he sees this general. Says, "Oh, I'm glad to see you." The general says, "Well, we haven't seen you for years. How are you doing?" He said, "Look, I want you to see my wife." And sure enough, Tatiana shows up. And Onegin says, "Oh yes, we once were neighbors." Well, Tatiana handles herself as a grande dame, as someone who's gotten a place in high society. She says to her, "Look, I've got a terrible headache. You've got to take me home." And of course, she manages to get out of the situation. And Onegin suddenly comes to his senses and realizes, my God, what a fool I was to reject her love. This is a wonderful person. Would be a wonderful person to be together with. And he writes her a letter. And of course, he receives no reply. So finally, in his anxiety and trying to get to her, he goes to visit her and ends up in her boudoir, in her bedroom, says, "Look, I love you enormously. I would like you to go with me." She says, "Now, wait a minute. When I was a young country girl, you wanted to have nothing to do with me. And now all of a sudden I'm a grande dame in society, and you want me to go away from my husband to create a tremendous scandal so you'll have the reputation of somebody who knows how to go after women." She says, No, you don't understand this. I love you. I want you to. She says, "Look, Onegin, I'm going to tell you this. I'm not going to lie. I'm going to tell you the truth. I love you. But I've been given to another. Я другому отдана, и буду век ему верна. I have given to another, and to him I will eternally be faithful." He says, No, you've admitted you love me. You've got to come with me. You can't go with me. And she leaves. And as she leaves, who do you think walks into the bedroom but her husband? Here is Onegin, who's just been trying to make love to his wife in her bedroom, no less. What's going to happen? And at that point, the poem ends. Pushkin, of course, leaves his protagonist in the situation. Now, in the opera, this is something different. Tolstoy, I'm sorry, using that the wrong name here. Tchaikovsky was, of course, like most Russians, enormously attracted to Pushkin. Furthermore, Tchaikovsky had been teaching in the conservatory, the musical conservatory in Moscow, and had received a letter from a young woman, a young student in the conservatory, who had fallen deeply in love with him and wanted to marry him. Now, Tchaikovsky was not the person, shall I say delicately, who didn't have much relations with women. He was a different approach to problems of romance and sex. But he didn't want to do to this lady what Onegin had done to Tatiana. And furthermore, he was in the process of trying to put this famous letter into music. And so he wrote back to her. He said, "Look, I would like to marry you, but you have to understand, I can't offer you a romantic relationship. I can only offer you the love of a brother." And she said, "Oh, that's wonderful." She of course didn't understand what was involved. "That's wonderful. All these people are coming to me and want to involve me in terrible sexual relationships outside of marriage. And here you are. You respect my independence as a woman. You respect my honor. That's marvelous." So Tchaikovsky, perhaps rather foolishly, agreed to marry her. And of course, she assumed that once they were married, she could seduce him into a real marriage sexual relationship. Well, of course, it didn't work, and the marriage turned into a terrible situation. Now, when Tchaikovsky came to the scene that was right before the duel, and he saw this long poem that Pushkin had written for Lenski, he turned it into an aria which has become probably the most famous and the most popular aria in all of Russian opera. And if you'll pardon me, although it's a tenor aria and I'm not a tenor, I'd like you to hear it. It goes something like this. Куда, куда вы удалились, весны моей золотые дни, что день грядущий мне готовит, его мой взор напрасно ловит, печальной жизни бурной. Ах, Ольга, я тебя любил, тебе единой посвятил рассвет печальной жизни бурной. Ах, Ольга, я тебя любил. И вечный друг, желанный друг, приди, приди, сердечный друг, приди, я твой супруг, приди, я твой супруг, приди, приди, я любви, я известный друг, приди, приди, я твой супруг. Куда, куда, куда вы удалились? Золотые дни, моей весны. Now you can see that Tchaikovsky has taken out of this a tremendously romantic, romantic piece.
Well, I suddenly lost your video.
In the original poem,
I lost your video all of a sudden.
The poem which comes right after this, in what Pushkin has written, Pushkin writes, «Так он писал, темной и вяло, чем романтизмом мы зовем. Хоть романтизма тут немало, не вижу я. Да что нам в этом?» He says, he wrote in the silly romanticism which is typical of a young man who understands nothing. In short, with his irony, he breaks down completely what Lenski has said. Whereas Tchaikovsky, in turning this poem into music, has made it something completely romantic. In short, they take the same material, two geniuses approach the same material when completely opposite points of view. Pushkin writes it as the song of a youth who doesn't know anything sensible about love and life, and Tchaikovsky makes it so romantic it becomes one of the most famous and popular arias in all of Russian opera. Yeah. And that's a wonderful example of how two geniuses approach the same material from completely different points of view. So what you have here is Pushkin destroying with irony the very beautiful thing that he's built up, and that's typical for Pushkin. He's a master of irony, and at the same time, a master of romance, although for him, of course, romance was something quite different from what his actual married wife had come to expect.
Yeah. That's really something special.
Now, in a somewhat different manner, Pushkin shows Tatiana terribly embarrassed and terribly worried about what Onegin will think about her having received a confession of love. And she knows that Onegin is going to come in, and she's waiting for him to approach.
Mm-hmm.
And while she's waiting, Pushkin gives you the song of some peasant fruit pickers on the estate who are singing because they have to prove that they're not eating the fruit that they're picking. The fruit belongs to the master who owns the estate. Remember, these are simply peasants who serve as his workers on the estate.
Mm-hmm.
And when they're singing within a poetry that's in a completely different rhythm from the poetry and the whole rest of Onegin. The poetry in Onegin is in the iambic kind of poetry, which is, of course, an unstressed and then a stressed syllable, unstressed, and so pa-pum, 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 pa-pum. Whereas what the girls are singing is in the dactyl rhythm, which is pa-pa-pum, 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 a completely different rhythm. And Tchaikovsky has made it into some beautiful music. What they're doing is, as they're picking the fruit, these are young girls, and of course very attractive, the men are trying to approach them. And they say, just let those men come close, we'll throw the fruit at them, and they'll get smashed with raspberries and strawberries, and that'll teach them to look at us. In short, the peasant girls have quite a different reaction to the men who are approaching them than Tatiana has in Onegin approaching her. And of course, the contrast to the poem is beautifully done. And Tchaikovsky catches the rhythm of what the peasant girls were singing just exactly right. And of course, the rhythm of this music, as opposed to the romantic music, is something that's very powerful in the opera.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the difference between the two.
Of course, one other thing that is rather interesting in this direction, you understand that both Pushkin and Tchaikovsky, of course, were very fluent in the French language. And Pushkin pretends that this letter, this beautiful letter that he's written, that Tatiana has presumably written, was read in French, and he's translated it. So you understand that French plays an enormous role. As a matter of fact, one of the epigraphs, one of the chapters about when he's talking about Tatiana, he says, "Elle était fille, elle était amoureuse." This is a quote from a French poem. She was a young girl, and therefore she had to be in love. And there are many different parts of the poem where French, there are pieces of French that are put in that he quotes from French poets of a different time and a different place.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Tchaikovsky, in the opera, when he's describing the name day party, has a French tutor who's been hired by the family. This was typical, of course, that they brought up their young girls by the imported Frenchmen who would serve as tutors and teach them the French language. It's a certain Monsieur Triquet. And he has come to write a praise of Tatiana on her name day. And this small song in French riez, riez, la belle Tatiana. Riez, riez, la 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 la. And then the chorus of the guests come to, bravo, 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 Monsieur Triquet. Bravo, 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 Monsieur Triquet, Triquet. This is one of the most popular scenes in the opera. It brings in all the listeners, and as a matter of fact, it's not in the poem at all. So here you have Tchaikovsky using French in his own way, and Pushkin claiming that this letter was written in French. And of course, you see the contrast between the way the peasant fruit pickers treats the men, and the way Tatiana tries to relate herself to Onegin. And then, of course, poor Onegin in the end realizes the mistake he's made, but it doesn't work. It doesn't work for him. So there are some wonderful emotional parts of the both of the opera and of the poem, and the poetry is when you read the poetry, you can almost hear the music. It's so beautifully done. As a matter of fact, somebody who heard one of my lectures said, "There's no music in poetry." I said, "Well, maybe not if you have a tin ear." And this Tchaikovsky turns it into music, which is a tremendously popular opera, which in some parts takes the words literally of Pushkin in the poem, and in some parts does something completely different. So again, you have two geniuses taking in some cases a completely different ways of approaching the same material, and in some cases do exactly the same thing. It's tremendously rich and tremendously appealing.
I guess I would steer it in the direction now of perhaps talking about maybe Nabokov and how he called the libretto Tchaikovsky's opera vile,
Yes.
quote unquote. We all, I mean, it's
Well,
always something very delicate to take such a beloved work and turn it into something else. So it's but how how does Tchaikovsky's artistry kind of transcend this comment? I mean, how does his artistic persona mesh with what remains in Pushkin?
well, our listeners, of course, should know that Vladimir Nabokov, a man who lived in the 20th century, as a matter of fact, he died in the 1970s, was a very famous critic of Russian literature, but a man who had his own ideas about literature, which often didn't jibe with the way that most of the world looked at it. And he was tremendously fond of Pushkin's poetry. As a matter of fact, he translated all of Onegin into English but he absolutely refused to put in any rhymes. He said in translation, the only thing that rhymes with the only words that are appropriate for rhyme are crime and slime. So his translation of Onegin is completely without rhyme, but word for word is exactly what each word means. So when he got to the opera, by the way, his son turned into a very famous opera singer. When Nabokov heard this music, he said, "This isn't Pushkin. This isn't Pushkin's all. That's the Weil opera." That's the way he referred to it, and it made me think that he had a wonderful ear for poetry, but not much of an ear for music. But in any case, from Nabokov's point of view, the opera is terrible in that it doesn't get the irony that Pushkin was such a master of. And of course, missing the irony in pushing the deep, the depth of Pushkin's meaning in his poetry, he thinks that the opera is a vile opera. This did not make Nabokov very popular among opera lovers in Russia. But of course, Nabokov's reputation as a literary critic, a reputation as an interpreter of Russian literature is so powerful and so important that a lot of people take his words very seriously. To me, of course, this is a mistake of Nabokov's. By the way, I once had a letter from Nabokov.
Wow.
I had well, for one thing, I had once written about Nabokov. We owe him a great deal of gratitude for what he's done for Russian literature in America, if only he would control that temper of his. And so he replied, "Well, for Mr. Weil, the good manners and a critic is very important, so much for Mr. Weil." So when my book on Gorky came out, I wrote Nabokov a letter saying, "Dear Mr. Nabokov, I know you don't like Gorky very much, but I'd be very grateful if you would tell me your honest opinion of this book." And he said, he replied, remember I talked about his temper. he said, "Dear Mr. Weil, thank you so much for your courtesy in sending me your book, with which I totally disagree." So this was my relation with Nabokov. Obviously, our opinions about the opera are quite different.
Sounds like he had something to say about everything.
I must admit that I had a lot of fun with that correspondence.
Wow, that's that's amazing.
He
Wow.
totally disagreed with me. Well,
Well, I feel like Nabokov disagrees with a lot of things. I mean, to call Onegin Tchaikovsky's Onegin Weil is, something that a lot of people will disagree with him on. Um,
as
but
you might imagine.
of course,
You
uh,
understand, of course, that Tchaikovsky, uh, there was a group of composers in Russia in the 19th century, called them, in English we call them the Mighty Five, who were nationalists in music. They said that a Russian composer must write Russian music, and to hell with any Italian influence, with any French influence, with any German influence. It has to be purely Russian. So when Tchaikovsky heard this, he said, "Well, what kind of nonsense is this? Music is music. Music, there's no nationalism in music." He said, "After all, is A flat a French note?" Uh, so Tchaikovsky was in complete disagreement with these members of the Mighty Five. And so between them, there grew up a kind of a musical debate, which they would argue with each other. And in arguing with each other, they produced some of the finest music in Russia of the 19th century, and some of the finest music in Europe of the 19th century. And that was Tchaikovsky's stance.
yeah.
Our listeners might also be interested to know most of them, of course, have heard of the Carnegie Hall in New York, the famous music hall in New York called the Carnegie Hall. The first conductor in that hall when it opened was Tchaikovsky.
Wow, I didn't
He
realize.
was invited to this country to open the hall by conducting the orchestra.
Wow,
So that's the reputation of Tchaikovsky, and of course that's also the reputation of the Nabokov and of Pushkin.
wow. That is, I didn't realize that he was the first person to open Carnegie Hall. That's amazing. Yeah. I guess one of the last things I wanted to talk about was Tchaikovsky's how he paints the characters in the opera is in a very calm and straightforward way, whereas Pushkin uses a lot of irony when he talks about his characters. And
Yes.
maybe
Yes.
just to highlight the difference between the characterization there and how Tchaikovsky's approach to painting the characters in such a way makes up for the loss of how Pushkin painted the characters in an ironic way.
I think I understand. What Tchaikovsky does, of course, in his opera is something that Tchaikovsky does so beautifully in an enormous amount of music that he composed. It's the emotion flows forward. It's romantic. It's powerful. It's something that makes your flesh tingle when you hear it. Pushkin is somewhat different, of course.
Mm-hmm.
Pushkin is well, you understand that Pushkin in his life had something like 137 different love affairs. As a matter of fact, the book that describes 136 of these affairs, and I wondered what happened to the 137. So Pushkin was no stranger to romantic love, but at the same time, he had a very piercing kind of intellect, a very piercing kind of intellectualism, which also came to his poetry. So there was always a contrast between the romantic urge to have love, to have loving relationships with men and women on the other hand, and on the other, the man who stands back and looks at it with irony, looks at it with kind of irony. Is this all there is to life? Simply to this love affair? And he puts it down with a kind of irony. So there's the contrast between an enormously romantic feeling and a powerfully beautiful feeling of poetry, and the notion that with your intellect, you look at this from a very high up position. Tchaikovsky, of course, is quite different. Tchaikovsky in his music, his magnificent music, his symphonies, his quartets, his operas, pictures love in a beautiful, expanding, flowing way. The music simply flows forth. And of course, this is quite a different approach to art, a different approach to what people are going to see, going to hear, and what they see. So you see these two poets. I'm sorry, you see these two men, a poet and a composer, approaching completely opposite points of view, and yet they're handling the same material. And in so doing, you get a picture of the tremendously different ways that art is presented to human beings. Art covers all the human emotions, from the most ironic, the most intellectual, the most deeply emotional. And when you put the two together, you have the enormous power, not only of art, but if you'll pardon me for this, the enormous power for Russian art. The Russians produced such powerful poetry and music and art of the 19th and 20th century, which I think is among the best that's ever been created. It's interesting that the young Pushkin, while he was just starting to write Onegin, had heard about Shakespeare. He didn't know English very well, so he read Shakespeare in French translation and was enormously impressed. He said, "My gosh, this is a great poem. I'm going to do for the Russian political theater what Shakespeare did for the English political theater." And in so doing, he brought Shakespeare into Russia. And so you see these two powerful poets fitting in with each other, just as Tchaikovsky and his music fit in with the poetry of Pushkin. It's a wonderful picture. It's a wonderful extension of the enormous, what can I say, the enormous emotional, intellectual power of music, of poetry, of art. And of course, the Russians made tremendous contributions. Among them, of course, Pushkin was one of the greats.
Wow.
I hope this makes sense.
Yes, that's incredible. And also, art mimics life, I suppose. Pushkin died in the same way Lenski died.
It's of course ironic, and bitterly ironic, that Pushkin died in a duel the same way Lenski did. And perhaps there was something of a foreboding in his writing of Onegin, in his own life. Pushkin had married a woman who was reputed to be the most beautiful woman in all of Petersburg. And of course, Pushkin had not behaved himself very well toward other married women. So there was a French officer who was serving in the Russian army who decided he was going to do to Pushkin what Pushkin had done to many others. He was going to make love to his wife. And of course, Pushkin was furious. And the result of this fury was a very nasty letter, which he wrote to the officer's Russian sponsor. And the officer had no choice but to challenge Pushkin to a duel, which was exactly what Pushkin wanted. And in that duel, of course, we lost him at the age of 37. And yet, by the age of 37, he had already written what amounts to 10 thick volumes of poetry.
Incredible.
He started very young, and the amount of poetry and the amount of literature he produced was incredible, especially when you remember he died at the age of 37. And what a terrible loss that was. Think of what he might have created if he'd gone on.
I know. I always think about that. I think about that with him. I think about that with Mozart, with Schubert, who all died, Chopin, who all died very young. Even Beethoven, he was in his 50s. Wow. Pushkin did a lot of duels before this one.
Unfortunately, he was a crack shot, and he very often challenged people. Sometime a person would make a remark, and it would infuriate Pushkin. He would say, "But I admire your poetry. That was no insult." And Pushkin would say, "No, I want a duel." And so, but of course, he survived many a duel, but alas, he did not survive this particular one.
What a fiery
French
character.
officer.
Fiery character that seeps into his work. That is really remarkable. I think we truly have explored so much of this. And
well, Pushkin's life would make an incredible play. The adventures that he had the incidents that he got himself into and the way he handled it are marvelously dramatic. And
Do that.
and well, that was the life of the kind of poet he wanted to be.
Yeah, he was writing himself into everything that he wrote.
That he certainly did.
Yeah, and that's the poetic character. I wonder if the same could be said about Tchaikovsky.
Well, to a certain extent, that you might say that's true. Uh, uh, Tchaikovsky got himself into all kinds of scrapes, as he did, of course, with the woman he married. That was a terrible thing for the whole rest of his life, because they separated, and she was constantly coming after him, and he was constantly trying to escape her. There were many very dramatic incidents in his life as well.
Mm-hmm.
To be an artist in Russia in those days was not the easiest thing in the world. Remember, this was Tsarist Russia.
Right. Yeah, Tsarist Russia, and then transition into Soviet Russia, which was also incredibly
Of course,
difficult.
there was a terrible revolution, which
Right.
killed, the fighting killed millions of people.
Mm-hmm.
When Russia turned into the Soviet Union, and now, of course, this is no longer the Soviet Union, it's again supposedly Russia.
Mm-hmm. Yes, lots of twists and turns produced just astounding.
As an American born who learned Russian and who got to know the Russians pretty well, it's a fantastically interesting country, and of course the history is enormously interesting, very, very dramatic. And of course, Russian people can be wonderful hosts and wonderful friends.
That's true. That's true. The right ones. It depends, of course, on everyone, but
Right.
yes, that's remarkable. I think we've covered a great deal, and I think it's such an honor to listen to you.
Well, in my life, it's played a big role. It's true. I've been going there since 1960, almost every year.
Yeah, your life has been astounding too. I mean,
The Russian temperament is a very interesting. A Russian friend is a friend to the end, but that means you have to be a friend to the end to them too. And if I go there and don't call them up, boy, there is trouble.
yeah, yeah, your life has been incredible too. I mean, no duels.
Thank goodness these days there are no duels.
No duels, but
At least none that I know of.
everything else has been incredible. Wow. Well, thank you for providing me with this incredible education on these works that I love so much. Onegin is my favorite Russian work of all time.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be with you and a great pleasure to be talking about these things, which I
yeah,
take so seriously.
it's so incredible, and I'm really hoping that the people listening will pick up Onegin in the near future or listen to it on a stream on YouTube or something. It's, if you haven't heard this piece or if you haven't read this novel in verse.
Well, I must say, Onegin in translation is very hard, very hard to get through, because it's written very, very simply, but it's not the simplicity of simple mindedness, it's the simplicity of genius. And to get the simplicity of genius across in translation is a very difficult thing to do. Nabokov tried to do it by not doing any rhymes, by just translating every word literally what that word meant. But of course, without the rhyme, you've lost a good deal of the poetry.
Right.
So reading it in translation is not so easy.
That's true of every language, really, but I think especially Russian, because it's so.
It's not like, let's say, Tolstoy or Dostoevsky wrote in prose. And of course, much of the power of that prose comes through in the translation.
I agree with
In the case of Pushkin, it's much, much more difficult.
Yeah, I agree. And I guess Onegin in Tchaikovsky's musical translation is perhaps the closest we can
If
get.
any of our listeners wants to read Pushkin, I would suggest that, first of all, they might try reading the prose the short prose works of Pushkin.
Hmm.
He wrote some very interesting. There's a short story called "The Queen of Spades," which, by the way, Tchaikovsky also made into an opera, "Pikovaya Dama" in Russian. The Queen of Spades. There's also one called Dubrovsky, which you can read and I think get great pleasure out of.
Hmm.
If one of our listeners wants to approach Pushkin, I would suggest get a collection of his short novels and short stories in prose first, and read that, and you'll get some sense of the power of Pushkin.
Or just learn Russian.
If you want to learn Russian, I can recommend a course.
But if you really want Pushkin, then learn Russian. That's the full Pushkin, or any Russian poet, really.
As Pushkin said, как уст румяных без улыбки, без грамматической ошибки, я русской речи не люблю. He said, like rosy lips without a smile, I cannot stand Russian without grammatical mistakes. Of course, because the young women often would talk so much French, they often made grammatical mistakes in Russian.
Wow, yeah. Yeah, like we said before, French was the language of the
In many ways, it was their first language. And of course, Pushkin was, as a matter of fact, Pushkin wrote many poems in French. And French people have said they're marvelous poets.
Wow, I didn't actually know that. So you can also access Pushkin in French. I wonder.
Pushkin wrote a poem called My Portrait. He said in French, Mon portrait, that is my portrait. Vrai singe par sa mine, voilà Monsieur Pushkin. He's a real monkey by his face, and there is Mr. Pushkin.
It wasn't very
Vrai singe par sa mine, voilà Monsieur Pushkin.
That's kind of mean to himself. Poor Pushkin.
That's Pushkin's approach to life. You might be interested to know that in 1825, there was a revolutionary uprising against the Tsar, which had to be put down by armed force. And it was carried out by many people who were school friends of Pushkin. So Pushkin was summoned to meet the new Tsar, Nicholas, and the Tsar said, Pushkin, if you had been in Petersburg when these people did this revolution, what side would you have been on? And Pushkin said, I would have been on their side. And the Tsar said, now that's what I like, a man of real courage, who has the courage to say what you know might be unpopular. But tell me, Pushkin, would you be willing to change your mind? And Pushkin said, well, yes, maybe I could. And he said, aha. He said, now you are my poet, and from now on, I, the Tsar, will be your personal censor. You can imagine how Pushkin liked this. Later on, the Tsar was heard to say, I've just talked with the most intelligent man in Russia.
Wow.
So while he didn't like his political approach, he realized that this is a highly intelligent man and one of the most talented, well, the most talented man in Russia.
Yeah, probably.
These kind of things are constantly happening to Pushkin.
Yeah, I suppose it added to his character, his ego, his ability to fight in a lot of duels and be confident about it.
Of course, there was a lot of jealousy on the part of people who would have liked to be poet number one, and who had to admit that Pushkin was. And there's a lot of, after all, there had been an attempted revolution in 1825. Pushkin died in 1837. So there was always the worry that this tremendously talented man might come out on the side that was very dangerous for the state. He was like a loose cannon in their view. And of course, he was likely to say almost anything at any point in his life. How were they to put up with such a character?
Right.
But at the same time, he was obviously tremendously talented, the greatest poet that they had.
Right.
From a certain point of view, I can see I can see the Tsar's point. I can see the Tsar's point.
That's true. That's true. Yeah, this is all so remarkable. I feel like I'm growing.
The whole history is a fascinating history. It really is. if anyone is interested, uh, there are 36 half-hour lectures of mine about Russian literature on DVDs. And if anyone is interested in these DVDs, on the internet, you can go to The Great Courses. It's called The Great Courses, and put in my name and classics of Russian literature. I guess you won't mind in my making an end here.
I really hope everyone does that. It feels like I was sitting in
I
one.
would be very happy if they did that.
I feel like I was just sitting in one now.
It's called The Great Courses.
I will link everyone to the comments, and I will link people to that website so they can listen to our viewpoints on much more Russian literature. Thank you for being here on this series with me. It is truly, from the bottom of my heart, such an honor for me to do this with you.
I think I quoted to you that business about the honor. Yeah. Have you read Huckleberry Finn?
Yeah, I have.
You know that he at one point there's some crooks that he describes along the Mississippi who go to various towns and cheat the townspeople and then leave. And at one point they're caught and they're tarred and feathered and put in sent out of town sitting on a rail. And one of them says, "If it weren't for the honor of the thing, I'd rather walk."
Yeah.
So that's the honor.
Well, thank you to the audience for being here too, and
thank you for giving me the chance. I really enjoyed it. If there's other things we can do together, I'll be happy to do it.
That would be really great. I have some ideas. We'll do it.
Okay.
Well, have a good night, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Look, I mean, for me, this is a great pleasure.
Bye.
Take care. До свидания.
До свидания.
До встречи. До встречи.
До встречи.